Hey everybody, this is Dr. Maples. Today we're going to talk about research design. In a research methods class, we finally are starting to get into the very basic components that we wanted to explore from day one, right? In fact, we kind of needed to introduce some ideas before we could get here. We needed to understand how knowledge is created. We needed to get a reintroduction to the ideas of science. And importantly, from our last lecture, we needed to get reintroduced to the idea of how we ask questions and, more importantly, ask sociological questions. So now we're going to start getting to the next part of this research process, and that's finding ways to identify answers to our questions. That's where we start today. Oh, I'm excited. Let's get started. All right, so what we're going to talk about in this first lecture series is we're going to talk about categorizing our research. Categorizing our research helps us understand what it is that we want to accomplish. Now remember, at this stage, we're still framing questions. We're still deciding what we would study, what phenomena, what social situations that we might be studying as part of our research. So we haven't done any data collection. We haven't even figured out how we're going to answer those questions. We're still thinking about how we're moving in that direction. And the first step is to try and categorize your research in a couple of different ways. Now, the first one is to try to understand what the purpose of the research is from day one. And that's going to be this slide and the next slide, just so we don't get them confused with the other slides. Now, if we're trying to understand what the purpose of our research is from the start, we really usually have three answers: exploration, description, or explanation. Now, exploration usually is something that just happens when you're initially trying to study either a new phenomena or you yourself are digging into an old existing phenomena. That's exploration. A good example of that is actually kind of where I am on maybe writing a book on telecommuting and teleworking amongst outdoor recreation users. I kind of started noticing that a lot of rock climbers seem to be doing telecommuting jobs, and I was just like, wonder if that's something that needs more research. And I looked at the literature out there, and there really wasn't anything, and so I was like, well, yeah, okay, maybe this is something we should explore a little bit. But I'm still so new in it, I'm really not creating new knowledge. I'm trying to understand the basics of it. That's a common issue, and we'll push through that with your theses. Don't be concerned about that, because you may be very much still exploring these new topics that you'll decide to write about for your final paper in the spring semester, not in this class. This class will have you write about very specific things, so don't be concerned. Another common way of categorizing your research is thinking about it as descriptive stuff. Remember what we've said about descriptive questions. They're usually not good research questions. And in fact, that's usually the case here. If you're trying to simply describe something, you may simply be writing a report for someone. Thinking about college students, how do college students look for parking spaces? I can give you an answer to that question. I can give you an answer to that question. But is it really like a research question? It's really just kind of like we're creating some information that's in a report, but it's not really new knowledge. It's not all that interesting. How do students feel about EKU parking? I can answer that as well. I can answer that right now, in fact. But again, it's not something that is super interesting. It's descriptive. That's okay, but these aren't really what we want to aim for as sociologists. In fact, we're aiming for a third category. We want to make sure that we're explaining things. We're explaining relationships. We're explaining why and how things happen. That's the domain of sociology, explanatory research. So we're going beyond the basics of exploring an idea and describing it, and now we're going to identify and explain how a phenomena being studied actually works in our society. A good sociological explanation question, an explanatory research question would be, how does poverty in rural Kentucky shape college enrollment in our state? Let's look at that for a moment. So on one hand, we have a variable here, it's poverty. And on the other hand, we have college enrollment. And we're looking at it in Kentucky. So now we're trying to understand that as this variable changes, how might it change this variable? That's very sociological, and this is all very related to society. And there's another good example. What variables explain why individuals accept a particular ideology, and how do these variables shape an individual's discriminatory behaviors? I mentioned in a previous class, our previous lecture, that one of our students is publishing a paper looking at if you are part of a particular group, how exactly does it shape your racist beliefs? And how do we find the relationships between those? And, and what kinds of racist beliefs might it shape? So these are, again, very sociological, and we're looking at two different variables here, and we're seeing how they're related. Another explanatory question might be something like, how might having improved predictable access to food correlate with higher grades amongst elementary students? We could explore that. That's a very possible study. And we're thinking about two variables. We're talking about predictable access to food and higher grades. And we're making this guess that maybe as this one changes, this one might change. So this is a good example of explanatory relationships, how one thing explains another, and this is the domain of sociology. In fact, as you put together your questions, start thinking about what ideas are related and what relationship you're trying to explain in your questions. Let's move on. Let's think of some other ways to classify our research. Now, another one, and this is particularly valuable, is trying to think about the scope of your work. One of two things can happen here. You can get very detailed on a particular kind of relationship where you're very pinpoint, talking about a very specific idea, or you can stay very broad. This is the difference between idiographic research and nomothetic research. Now, with idiographic research, we focus on a very specific phenomena, and we are exhaustive in studying it. In fact, what often happens at this kind of research is that you may have what we call triangulation, where you're using different kinds of methods and different measures to try and really hone in on this idea. A good example of this, and it could be a book topic, just to be very clear, is why do immigrants from Latin American countries find jobs in cattle slaughterhouses in the Midwest? This is a very specific kind of relationship that we're looking at, and you could look at this idea from multiple methods. You could use surveys, you could use ethnographic research, you could use observations, you could use thematic analyses, you could do all sorts of different things to try and understand why this relationship is here. But it's very detailed, do you see? Let's look at a less detailed version of that. In fact, we'll use my dissertation research as an example. My dissertation was a nomothetic study where we keep things very big and it's less detailed, and we're trying to describe sort of an idea in general. We are trading out the detail of an idiographic study for the breadth of a nomothetic study. And my dissertation topic was, why do immigrants use ethnic niches? There's a link to my dissertation if you get bored and want to read it. You'll be one of like 6 people in the world that's read it. With my research, I simply wanted to understand why it is that immigrants came to the United States and they worked in specific jobs, something we call ethnic niches. Again, in the first question, the idiographic question, that's also an ethnic niche. Immigrants going in from Latin America and working in slaughterhouses. But that's a very detailed version of it. With idiographic research, we're getting very detailed. You could do interviews, you could do ethnographic research, observations. You could do all these different things, interviews, focus groups, surveys, collect all different kinds of data. With a nomothetic study, it's actually very, very broad. In fact, I used secondary data for all my analysis. It's data that was collected by, the American Community Survey. And they were very broad questions looking at metropolitan statistical areas. So again, a very broad question. I traded out the detail of an idiographic study for the breadth of a nomothetic study. Nomothetic studies can be great things for undergraduate researchers too. They give you a chance to apply theories very easily, whereas with an idiographic study, you may need more resources to study an idea very up close. Then again, maybe you're just in the scenario that you can do that, or you can study a very detailed relationship using surveys and the resources that you have available. Either way, thinking about the scope of it, is it really up close or is it really far away, is a good way of categorizing your research so you know what you're trying to do. Let's check out some others. All right, this one's a bit controversial. Are you ready for this? From the start, we want to categorize what we're really wanting our research to do. What kind of contribution do you want it to have? There's applied and there's basic. And I'm going to give you the book's definition of basic, and then I'm going to give you my definition of basic. Now, with applied research, this is 95% of the work I do. This is work where I want to make sure my research is seen by as many people as can see it, and that it's in the hands of the people I'm studying and the communities that I'm studying, and that it can be used to shape policy, that it can be used to help communities and do all sorts of things, support grant applications and more. My research on the Red River Gorge is a good example of that. That report made it all the way to Washington, D.C. It's being used around the United States, around the world. It's been in lots of different newspapers and media and more. It's been very exciting. That's a great example of applied research. Now, the flip side of that is basic research. And the textbook describes basic research as you're contributing to greater sociological ideas. I like the way that they put that basically you're writing research that just kind of helps other sociologists learn more about the world. That's fine. I'm not saying there's something wrong with that, but I will say if you're going the basic route, you're fine with the fact that A, no one's ever going to read your research, and B, your research is probably going to do nothing. It's probably not going to be useful because, frankly, there's so much basic sociological research out there that no one reads. I can't imagine many studies being anything else. So what I encourage you to do is categorize your study as an applied study. Find the people that you can help with your study. Find the communities that you can serve. Let's pretend that you're doing a very detailed study, very detailed study, right? An idiographic study on student experiences. And you're trying to understand, what variables might shape them feeling safe on campus. This is a very applied piece. You could make this report into something that the university could use. It would be helpful to them. And in helping the university, you're also helping other students. So this is a very applied research. Or you could write the report, publish it in a journal, and no one will read it. And that's fine. That's fine. You have to do those. I have to do some of those. But nonetheless, that's what it's done. It's not really doing anything. So think about that as you categorize your research. It'll help you give a little bit of ideas about where you want to go with your studies. Let's move on. Let's see what else we can learn. All right, this is the fun one. We're finally getting to those words that make us feel like we're getting into research, right? We want to think from the start how we're going to collect data, not in like the specific methodology that's coming up really soon, not the methodology, but what kind of data we might have. Are we talking about numeric data or are we talking about something else? Now remember, with numeric data, we're talking about quantitative data. Quantity, you're counting numbers. Quantitative data is always thinking about numeric values. How many, how often, how frequently, or maybe you're measuring emotion and you're rating them on a scale of 1 to 5. We'll come to find out that's called a Likert item. Now, a good sociological example of quantitative research. What is the average educational attainment for Kentucky counties? That's a descriptive question. We're going to pair it up with something else. How is this variable influenced by the county's average household income? This is a very quantitative question because you can see how we have educational attainment, something that I can quantify as like a percentage of people graduating from high school, for example. And the average household income, again, something very numeric. It could be $33,000. We don't know. But these are quantitative figures. Qualitative, we're looking for something other than numbers. We might still use numbers, but we're looking for something other than numbers. Maybe experiences in their own words, or watching people to understand how they interact with an idea. For example, how do immigrants experience work in ethnic niches, and how do these experiences prevent upward mobility? So again, we're trying to understand how ethnic niches, a very social thing in our society, and how immigrants experience labor markets. We're trying to understand how those function. And, surveys might help. We could collect some quantitative data about how they feel about things. But this might be something that we can study by observations or even by doing an ethnography. Maybe we try to experience that labor market. We interview people. We collect information on their experiences. We code them we categorize them into different kind of themes and ideas. Again, this is a very qualitative approach. Now, which of these two do you think is faster? I'll give you a quick hint. Quantitative research is always going to be quicker than qualitative research. I could write a quantitative book in a year. To do a qualitative book is going to take me 3, maybe even 4 or longer years. That's always the case. Qualitative research takes more time. With research as an undergraduate, I always suggest going quantitative. Quantitative is going to be a quicker way for you to get from point A to point B. It also means, too, that you're going to be able to spend more time writing your thesis rather than worrying about trying to collect data for it. Now, we'll explore this idea a lot more this semester. We're going to see some quantitative specific methods that are great for quantitative research, and we'll also see some other ones that are qualitative examples of methodologies. And you'll get a chance to experiment with some of those as well. You get to choose which ones you want to do. All right, that's going to wrap things up for our first half of our lecture. In the follow-up lecture, we're going to talk about some important terminology that'll help support you as you grow as a methodological researcher. All right, if you have questions, you feel free to contact me. I'm happy to help. Likewise, feel free to stop in for office hours or email me to set up an appointment outside of office hours. Thanks again. Take care. If you have questions or need help, you let me know. See ya.